Hi everyone, and welcome to another tutorial here on www.unitycookie.com. This is the fourth in the tower defense tutorial series. In this one we'll be taking a look at probably a funnest one, or the best one so far. That'll be making an actual attacking unit, in this case some sort of flying jet thing that'll fly in and knock your health down or whatnot. So let's take a look at how this works. So in this case we have a field with some SAM turrets and one regular turret. And pretty simple, just like this. We've got these guys that come flying in. They'll get a bit of a smoke trail as they're damaged. Only the actual surface-to-air turrets will shoot at these flying units. The regular turret will not. They explode after a certain amount of damage. And if we go up and look from the top here, and let's pause it, there is also just sort of an improvised base trigger on this. So essentially this would be if the if the unit the enemy managed to make it past all your turrets and to your base, then you'd lose a point to your health or whatnot in the game, however you have it set up. So that's pretty much it. Let's look at how this is put together. So the major addition, of course, is the flying unit, and that is I've added down here in a folder called enemies and then attack jet. Here's the prefab, and if we drag that right into the scene, let's take a look at it here. So this is just a sort of flying, some sort of jet-looking thing that I created for an old stylized game back in the day, and thought it would work well to be used in this. Of course, if you've downloaded the files, you have this as well, and you're welcome to use it however you like. One thing with it, it does use the older particle system. I didn't really see a need to recreate these in the new one. They work just fine, but just be aware of that. It's using the older regular particle system, not the new shuriken system or whatnot. So on this, we have, of course, prefab over top level. In here there's the audio source, which is just a looping jet sound, which I actually made using a hairdryer. So always lots of nice ways you can create things like that. A little bit of creativity. Below that, just got a rigid body on it, of course, to make sure the collisions and such work fine. A box collider around it, which is a trigger for the missile to hit, or when it runs into anything like the player-based trigger. And lastly, of course, the actual script on it. And a couple things on this script, which we'll get into in more detail later, but basically just a height range, so that way whenever this spawns in, it spawns in at just a slightly different height each time to make sure that, or to help make sure that they don't run into each other, and just to give it some visual difference. And the speed range, same thing. So that's just so that all the ships aren't doing exactly the same speed. We have a forward speed, and this is going to be set more in the script itself. We could actually make this a private variable, come to think of it, and we'll look at that in the script later. We have the health of the ship itself, pretty straightforward there. The smoke trail, this is the trail that it starts to leave as it gets damaged. Let's take a look at that here. We turn the emit on. You can see it's just a pretty straightforward smoke trail coming out the back. So gives it a nice look as it gets damaged more and more. And lastly, we have reference to an explosion effect prefab, which is just as it sounds, goes kaboom, and makes it look like the ship exploded once it's taken full damage. So that's the attack jet prefab. Let's look at the script that's making it do its thing. So in here, once again, we have, first of all, the variables for the height range, speed range, and so forth. And you'll notice these are actually vector 2's, and I'm doing this so that I don't have to create, say, variable max height range, variable min height range, variable min, variable max speed. This way I can just have one simple variable, but using it as a vector 2 means that in the script area here I get an x and a y option. Vector 3 obviously would have 3 options if you needed something like that. So it's just a nice little trick so you can have fewer variables and access them easier. So for this, down in the start function, I automatically call in and set the speed and the height of the starting ship. Whenever this starts, it sets itself to be a random.range between the basically minimum speed and max speed, and the minimum height and the max height, without having any extra variables. So nice little trick that you might already be using, but just in case, there you have it. Good to use. So the forward speed, again, that's set by this, and let's actually make this into a private variable. It's not needed to access that directly at all. Oops. Fix that. Okay. So now that's gone from there since we don't need to access it. We only access the actual min and max. So we also have a health, the smoke trail and explosion effect, of course, and we have a private max health. And this is used so that we can store the actual full health right away on start, since we're initiating or turning on that smoke trail based on a percentage of health. So we could have, one way to do it would be to have two variables, open, a max health and a starting health. Once again, that's just creating two variables that every time I edit this ship, I'd have to make sure the starting health and max health were always exactly the same. But instead, I just have a private variable max health, and on start, I automatically set that to be the same as the actual health. So just saves an extra step over here and make sure that it's always the same, so you don't have any errors coming from that. Looking at the function update here, one very simple call, we're just going to move the jet forward along its own z-axis, so vector3.forward. We're multiplying that by the forward speed, of course, and that times time.delta time. And we've gone over this a couple times before, but just in case, time.delta time is a really handy way to make sure that things are moving per second and not per frame. If this was simply transform.translate vector3.forward times forward speed, it would be moving forward speed every single frame. So depending on the frame rate of your game, obviously, it could be all sorts of different speeds, and it would slow up and down, as the game went up and down. So time delta time makes sure that this is a per second operation. Okay, so that's function update. Going down, we have a take damage function, and this is going to be called whenever a missile actually hits the ship. And we'll look at how the missile calls that a little later when we get into it, but just looking through how this works, as usual, pretty straightforward. We have the function coming in here. It's going to be passed a damage amount from the missile, and we have simply health minus equals damage amount, so dropping the health down, and then we find out the health percent using the current health divided by the max health, and then do a check to see right away, so is the health less than or equal to 0? If it is, explode. If not, if it is, explode and then exit this loop, of course. And just looking at the explode here, simple, instantiate the explosion effect, destroy the game object. Straightforward there. So back up here, so let's say the health is not less than 0, less than or equal to 0, so that ship is still alive. So we're going to check the health percent itself, and we'll see if it's less than 0.75, then we do want to turn on the smoke trail. So again, since this is using the older the older particle effects from Unity 3.5 back, if I remember correctly. Anyway, it's not the Shuriken, the newer ones. We use smoke trail.emit equals true. If you're building your own particle effects, that would be just play for the newer one. In this case, it's true since I'm doing it that way. So there's that. One thing, we could fix this up a little bit. If you might have noticed, the only time we actually use this health percent here is underneath in the else if health percent. So we could actually just take this, place that there, get rid of this entirely, and then we do one less call just in case. So if it is dead, or if it is at health of 0, it's not going to do that division, and otherwise if it is, if it's still more than 0, and we're only going to check that number here. So one less tiny function. In a game like a tower defense especially, it's probably going to be for mobile, and you're probably going to have lots and lots of items on the screen. It's always good to make it as absolutely efficient as possible. So tiny little thing like that might just help your game gain a couple of frames per second. So there we have that. And let's take a look at the missile next, see how that's been modified a bit. And once again, I'm still just modifying based on all the previous items we created, so if you haven't gone through the previous tutorials, it would definitely be a good idea to do those, especially in this case, the tutorial for the SAM turret, the one that's shooting the surface-to-air missile turret, since we're just reusing its components exactly, trying to keep everything modular. And in this case, we have the missile, which we've modified just a little bit to make it work here. So I'm going to drag that into the scene as well. I've done some visual modifications to this as well. I just added a light onto it, so as it travels around it leaves a light just by dropping on the light component. Pretty simple. If, again, you were using this for a real mobile game, that would probably not be a good idea. It might really knock down your frames per second. You could give it a try, especially, things are getting more and more powerful these days. And especially if this is for web or PC or whatnot, it shouldn't be a problem at all to have that extra light component on there. So let's take a look at what we edited on here. Just one thing added visible in the script here is the damage amount. And this is just so that you can set an exact amount, useful especially if you have upgrades available, so you can have maybe different ammunition for your turrets in the game, or upgrading the turret itself, things like that. You can set the actual damage amount real simply through here. Let's look at how this script has changed. So my damage amount obviously is added in there. The one thing we've added to this is that in the on-trigger enter, which we had before, and if you remember before in the SAM turret, we simply had a little cube that was labeled enemy, and whenever it came into range, it would get shot. Pretty straightforward. But we want to check things a little bit differently. Number one, that this missile will only actually be able to hit flying enemies. So I've created a new tag called air enemy, and this also comes into effect with the regular turret. We'll look at some more in a second. So instead of just checking for the tag to be enemy, we check for air enemy, and if so, obviously do the old function explode. And then we're going to add one more thing as well, in that we do other.gameObject and then a send message take damage. So again, this is referencing the function take damage here. We're going to call that on the object we just hit. We're going to send my damage amount, and we're using send message options.don't require receiver. And we use this because if that isn't on there, you're going to get an error pop up if the object it hit does not have take damage, a function called take damage in one of its scripts. This is good and bad in some ways. It's good because you won't get the error if it's not there. It's bad, like let's say you were first building this, it might be a good idea to actually take this off, because this really should only be hitting things that have that function. If it hits something and this is called and it doesn't have that function, you probably have something wrong in one of your scripts or where something is set up. So maybe even leave this off until you're ready to build out the game or to test on further things. But I'm just turning it off. I usually do because I know I don't need to see it, and sometimes there's a slight chance it might hit something else, and I just don't want that error to pop up. So anyway, that's what that's good for there. So once again, like I said, it calls the function damage, sends in the damage amount, and does it as we need. Next up, we had to modify the SAM turret just a bit. Let's look at that. Oops, scrolling in and out. Alright, so down on the SAM turret script, we have a couple small changes. Number one, our old function on trigger enter used to be very simple. We've added just a little bit more to it. Before it was doing an on trigger enter, so the main problem with that is whenever something enters the trigger, of course, the turret will notice it, aim, start firing until it explodes. And that works perfectly fine as long as things are just entering the trigger. But the problem you're going to have, of course, is one item is going to enter it, the turret will start firing at it, and in that time, unless you have a very slow tower defense game or something, more and more enemies are going to be flooding in and entering its range, and it's simply not going to shoot at any of them because they're already in its range, and this function is the on-trigger enter is of course only called exactly as something enters into it. So that's where we now have function on triggers stay, and this is simply called anytime a trigger is staying within its range, basically within its collider. So it's constantly going to retarget if it needs to, find the new enemy, so forth. On that subject, of course, we're also checking so that it's not constantly switching targets. We check first of all if it doesn't already have a target, then it's going to go ahead and check if the object that's in it is an air enemy. Once again, we change that from up here enemy to air enemy, and this way, since its range is obviously just a spherical item like this, Otherwise, it could target ground objects that come in, and that might be useful if you have some sort of like a rocket launcher that's able to launch to ground or air. But in this case, it's just a regular SAM only launching to air. So we set that to if the tag is air enemy only, and then we do the exact same thing as before. Nothing has changed. We set the fire time, we set the target, and everything is taken care of from there. So straightforward on that. Still, of course, the trigger exit, we want it to lose target if it exits the range. So those are the only changes to the SAM turret. And next we've had to do some quick modifications, about the same thing to the regular turret, ground turret you might call it. Let's take a look at this here. So you might have already guessed, simply set the in its function on trigger enter on the cannon turret, we've set it to look for the tag ground enemy. So this will just make sure that it's not going to shoot at anything in the air, otherwise it'll keep trying to shoot the others. Of course, if this is allowed to shoot at air enemies or some such. We've set that to ground enemy. And that's all for the ground turret. Next, let's take a look at the sort of cheated in player base type object that we have. So I just have this labeled as player base trigger. I'm just using this at the moment. So if we look at it again from the top here, anytime one of the enemy ships or anything runs into this, it simply disappears. Obviously in a future tutorial we're going to have it set, so of course the player loses health, you lose a point, whatever, however your game might work. But this right now is simply something with a triggered box collider and a script that I have called player base, and it simply checks if something hits it and it's either a ground enemy or an air enemy, so either one of course, then destroy other.game objects. So we're just destroying whatever hits it instantly. So this keeps it, at the moment, as this current tutorial is working, this just keeps you from having tons of these items just flying on and on and on forever. Simple as that. So of course in the future, like I was saying, this would be how you would detect and see when something actually made it past your defenses and deducts a point or health or whatnot. So pretty simple there. Now we have, I guess, the major component that we've added, which is the level master, which we're going to start adding a lot to as this tutorial moves on. And we use that for controlling exactly, at the moment, just the spawning and keeping track of some things. So let's look at that. I've gone and added it to the main camera. I generally do this just because I always know exactly where these top level control scripts are. Drop them right in the main camera. Simple enough as long as there's only one main camera. I find it's a good place to put it. So on here we have the level master script, and in the script, I'm not looking at the script right now, but over here on the side in the inspector, a couple things right away. The flyer prefab that we're going to spawn in, we have the flyer spawns, and we have the flyer intervals. This is how often we're going to spawn in the flyer. So the flyer spawns is actually just referencing a single item, which then has all the actual spawn points as children of it. So this way, we'll get into some detail on this in the script, we can simply move through all the children as one and not have to have an open variable on here, which is an array, and drop in each and every single one of these spawn points. Because if you have a lot, and if you're making a good game, you probably will have a lot of these, so it doesn't look repetitive that they're coming from the same location. It just, you don't have to drag them in one by one and lose track of which are which and so forth. So it just takes care of it for you. So let's take a look at how this comes together in the level master script here. So once again, we have the prefab variable. Flyer spawns is just a transform, so that's the top level transform. And then we have a private variable that actually is going to become the array that holds all of them. We have the interval, how often they're coming in, and just another use for the interval, the next flyer spawn time, just like we did with the back in the day with the turret, the next fire time and so forth. So take a look at that a bit more later. In the start, we're going to first just find all the spawn points that are inside of the top level transform here. And this is why we made a transform, because you can do a very simple for variable the spawn point transform in flyer spawns. It'll automatically dig through all the children this way, since flyer spawns is already a transform. When you do a for loop like this, it just searches through all of them as if you're searching through an array. It's the exact same thing. So I can automatically just use a for loop and go through all of its children. Of course, this is only I guess you'd say next layer children or whatnot. If, for example, this one was underneath this, it's not going to find this one that's down here a second layer deep. It's only looking for things in the top layer. You need to do some sort of recursive code if you wanted to do that. So anyway, we're looking through, grabbing all the spawn points and dropping them into this private variable, which is an array of all the actual transform points of the actual spawn points. I guess that should be pretty self-explanatory, hopefully. Just goes through and does that. Okay, so moving on, more exciting things. In the function update, obviously we just check and see if it's time to spawn a new flyer. We go ahead and do that. And this function just does first of all, reset the spawn time interval, and then we get a random.range for the location they want to spawn at. So I'm just using a sort of an index here, anywhere between 0 and the flyer spawn points.length. And we're doing .length because whenever you use a random.range on an integer, it actually cuts off the last one. So if I said 0 to 3 or something, and then if you printed that every time, you'd actually only get 0, 1, and 2. Which makes sense sometimes. I think it's Unity trying to be smart and make sure you don't mess things up. But I think it would be a lot easier if they simply went ahead and left it be and let people figure it out themselves. As it is, though, in this case, we can just do the array.length, which I guess is easy, but I would honestly, like I'm saying, rather do it -1 to feel like it makes more sense. But it just calls, finds a random integer to be the index, and then we instantiate the flyer prefab at a location based on that index, any one of the random spawn points, and then also the rotation, just to make sure when the ship spawns in, it's pointing in the same direction that we also have set on these spawn points, so it's coming in the right direction there. And that's it so far for the level master, just spawning some ships in, keeping track of when they ought to be, and of course the spawn points. So with just a little bit of work, adding some extras, making sure your turrets are attacking the right things and so forth, you can just run through this tutorial. If you have the files to download, it'll be simple to make sure that you have everything set up. Otherwise, just let me know in the comments if anything doesn't make sense. Hope I went over it. This one's pretty straightforward since it's just a flying unit coming through and adding some tags and such. But let me know if anything doesn't make sense. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.